Good morning and welcome to CNAS. My name is Philip Shears. I'm a research associate with the Defense Program here, and I'm thrilled to be moderating today's panel on the U.S. defense budget and how the Department of Defense resources its strategic objectives. Over the past several months, Carlton, Haelig, and I have been working on a research project that looks at the U.S. defense budget and exactly that. How does it resource its strategic goals? The heart of this study is a question of how the department invests in the capability areas that are most critical to deterring and, if needed, prevailing in a conflict against China. In other words, how does the Pentagon allocate its limited budget to bolster deterrence? How does it develop and buy new systems? And how does it balance its resources across time to both modernize in the long term while also shoring up deterrence in the near term? Our bottom line finding is that in several key capability areas, the department has struggled to transition key programs to the field and has not bought enough new weapons to bolster deterrence. However, we also find that it is not a lost cause. In several capability areas, we identify and argue for expanded procurement and faster transitions to the field. To talk more about these issues and beyond, I'm joined by an excellent panel today. To my left is Dr. Carlton Haelig, a fellow with the Defense Program and the leader of the defense budget research here at CNAS. He's the lead author of our Stuck in the Cul de Sac report, which you can grab a copy of outside. Seated in the center is the Honorable Susanna Bloom, who is a distinguished senior fellow at CNAS and the former director of cost assessment and program evaluation at the Pentagon. And then to the far left here is Todd Harrison, senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where he leads a prolific research portfolio on space policy and defense budget issues. We will be making time for questions today, both from the online audience and in person. If you're joining us online, please identify yourself in the chat box on the CNAS website. We will not be taking anonymous questions. And if you're in person joining us, please raise your hand when the time comes, and then our staff will come around with a microphone when we call on you. So to start us off, I think it would be great for us to just start by defining the problem. The United States has the largest defense budget in the world, and yet there is widespread concern that the U.S. military is losing long-held advantages to China. What is the problem the Department of Defense should be trying to solve, and what does that mean for its budget? Carlton, I'll turn to you first, and then if we want, we can work down the panel and everybody can chip in.
Sure. Well, thank you, everyone, for being here today, and thank you to my co-panelists for joining us this morning. As everybody in this room is familiar, the defense budget is massive. It's exceedingly large. Sometimes the numbers themselves are hard to grapple with. What we looked at specifically was how systems go from research and development stages to procurement and being introduced as systems, platforms, munitions, et cetera, that are available to the joint force for deterrence and, if necessary, warfighting situations. The RDT&E, as it's called, the research and development title, and then the procurement title, they make up not the largest portion of the budget by any means, but they are critically important to resourcing the force for today, but also going forward into the future. Obviously, right now, we are concerned with deterring China and other great power adversaries in the near term, but also in the long term. The problem that we identified is that there is an increasingly growing emphasis that's being placed on researching and developing the systems of tomorrow, while the emphasis on purchasing enough of the correct systems that are most relevant and most relevant to deterrence in the Indo-Pacific, that number has actually remained stagnant over the years. So for all of the emphasis on modernization now and modernization for the future, what we found is that the future really dominated the budget the last several years. So what that means is that in the near term, the force is growing smaller, it's becoming less capable, it's becoming more expensive to maintain and operate, and big bets are being placed on these next generation systems that, while they will likely be highly capable, are still quite a ways off. So what we found is that there is a gap between what's available now and what's required now to maintain deterrence in the near and the medium term, and the emphasis that's being placed on those long-term objectives.
Thanks. It's very helpful. Susanna and Todd?
Yeah, Carlton, I think that was a great description. I think one thing, though, that it's important not to lose sight of is that not all of the problems that you alluded to are solvable with money. Money is not the only limiting factor that exists in this ecosystem. It's certainly helpful, but necessary but not sufficient generally. And so, sometimes there is a really direct choice or trade-off between investing that next marginal dollar in a research effort versus procuring something that exists in the here and now today. Sometimes, no matter how badly we might want to procure another widget, you just can't, not for all the money in the world. And so I think we can dive a little deeper into some of those trade-offs as we dig into the conversation.
Yeah, no, I echo, the thoughts have already been expressed here, but I guess one thing I would add, because there are many problems, right, that DoD is grappling with, some better than others. But one I would want to highlight is the types of systems we tend to spend so much time, so much money, on research and development and bringing them into production. They tend to be systems that are not actually designed to scale. That they're designed, the whole manufacturing process, but also the technology itself, we're designing it from the beginning with the idea that we're only going to buy, dozens or hundreds or, very low production rates, given the scale of the threats that we're facing. And I think that's one of the big changes we need to see is we need to start designing with scalability in mind from the beginning. We need, especially when it comes to munitions, we can't be building the super exquisite, super effective, Ferrari version of the munitions if we can only buy them, a few dozen a year. We need to be designing things that we can really mass produce, that we could expand production rapidly if we needed to. That kind of scaling has got to be baked into the beginning of programs, and too often we forget that.
Yeah, and I think that relates perfectly to the point that it's not just the character of the design itself being scalable, but also the stability of the design being consistent and in place from the beginning. It doesn't work to just change the design to be scalable midway through the program. That's just going to result in further trouble. So let's dig into a little bit more of these hurdles and challenges that the department has been facing. I know we've mentioned that some of them are not necessarily money related. Susanna, can you take us to that step deeper? What are the challenges that the department is facing in this space?
Yeah, well, there are many. Just a couple kind of off the top of my head. The first is that science is hard. And very often some of the biggest successes that we point to in terms of really innovative defense programs, if you look back a little deeper into their history, they looked troubled at one point in time. Bob Hale, who's a former comptroller of DoD, often compared major defense programs to children. He's like, when they're babies, they need like a lot of time and attention, but generally they do what you want them to do. And then they all go through some horrible rebellious adolescence, which is a nightmare. And then many of them, if not most, turn out to be productive, contributing, adult members of the society at some point. But it's never a straight line. The second is that as hard as science is, integration is even harder. And this, kind of picks up Todd's thread a little bit. I don't mean integration narrowly in terms of like getting the radar on the airplane, although that's certainly hard in and of itself. And there are lots of things we could do to make that easier and more efficient in the way that we design these systems. But, what is your logistics supportability plan? It works great in a laboratory under the supervision of 7 PhD physicists. What happens when you hand it into an 18-year-old in the desert, right? These challenges are not small. They're really hard things to do. Further, the threat is not standing still, right? So, every year we evolve. Our adversaries continue to evolve as well, which sometimes necessitates a change in what we thought we were doing in order to maintain or extend or sustain or recapture an advantage that may have existed before that does not as a result of some new development. And then the last thing I'll say is that part of this, I think, is a question of attention, right? So there is a tremendous amount of attention in the Department of Defense, in the Congress, in the White House, amongst us sitting around here on budget formation. And I would suggest that we sometimes need to put more attention against execution, right? And making sure that industry can and is properly incentivized to actually deliver the things that the department wants to buy.
Todd, anything you'd want to add?
Yeah, I pull on a thread that Susanna started on about how threats are advancing, right? And, this is kind of like a Moore's Law problem of compounding, increases in capabilities over time. And when your threats are increasing at an exponential pace, you have no choice but to increase your capabilities at an exponential pace as well. Now, that often leads us down this rabbit hole of investing in very exquisite, highly capable systems that don't scale, right? And so we've got this trade-off between we have to keep up with threats, at least maintain our level of technological advantage, and not let it erode any more than it probably already has in many areas. But in some cases, we need to be pulling ahead, right? And I mean, that ends up creating a dilemma. And at the heart of it, though, is our innovation cycle time. And that's where we fall behind so much. If you just take, for example, some of the flagship programs that are supposed to be speeding the pace at which we innovate and get to the next generation of technology, they're not. Like the F-47, previously Next Generation Air Dominance Fighter, you look at that program, that budget line started funding 10 years ago. It took 10 years just to get to the point where we awarded a contract. And it'll be probably another 5 years before we have anything delivered from that that's even remotely close to operational. So that, a 15-year cycle time from when you start funding something to when you've got something flying operationally, that's not moving faster.
But it depends on what it is, Todd. I mean, the truth is, a genuine leap ahead capability takes 10 to 15 years, us and our adversaries.
If you want to keep developing the next generation of the same capability, right? And so that's where we need to be looking and saying, okay, if a 6th-gen fighter is going to give us some incremental level of capability that's greater, or we could go to something that's not a fighter at all, not a manned fighter. That's where we ought to be making the trades and where we can move faster.
Yeah, I think the danger is implying that a similar technological advancement could be achieved by China in some kind of shorter time frame, which just I don't believe is true.
No,
Again, physics are physics.
They're not. But the thing is, our 6th-gen fighter doesn't really need to match a 6th-gen Chinese fighter. It needs to match a next-generation Chinese air defense system. Which, yeah, those missiles and the radar systems that they use and everything they use for targeting and tracking, they can advance at a faster cycle time.
Absolutely.
And so that we've got to get out of these losing cycles of competition where we're not going to be keeping pace with threats. We may be keeping pace with a symmetric adversary, but we're not fighting a symmetric adversary.
I think the sort of historical context in which some of these investments sit and some of these innovation cycles sit. So, David, if you wouldn't mind throwing up the graphic from the report on the screen quickly. I think one of the really interesting findings that were products that Carlton and I were able to put out was an examination of the top line budget and the share of the top line budget that RDT&E and procurement comprised respectively year over year going back to the 1970s. And I think that this does get a little bit to your point, Todd, on innovation cycle time. But I'll let Carlton explain it. So Carlton, why are RDT&E and procurement such an important part of the story here?
Yeah, so cycle time, we look at cycle time, and there are areas where science is hard, science is costly, and it takes a lot of time. So there are certainly areas, particularly on the higher end, the more exquisite end, where it's very hard to condense those cycles. We are obviously now, as a defense ecosystem, moving to quicker, cheaper, faster cycle times, but it's unavoidable for some of those higher end things. What Phil's alluding to here is that we wanted to kind of put the current moment of modernization and budgeting into a context of the broader scope of defense modernization within the United States. So we look back roughly 50 years, going back to the 1970s, and thought about when were there other periods of heightened geopolitical competition, periods where there was a changing threat environment that coincided with very significant changes in technology, military technology, the character of war, the concepts supporting the use of new weapon systems. And what was the intensity of RDT&E, research and development spending, and procurement spending during those various time periods? Obviously, over time, it's gotten more expensive to do a lot of these things. Basic research has grown more costly. The defense articles that we are producing are themselves more costly for the most part. So we just put them in a ratio to one another and just saw, all right, relatively speaking, how much in a given time period are we investing on research and development versus how much we're investing in actually purchasing things. We found, as you'll see here, that things were quite intense on the procurement side. We were purchasing a lot of things and spending much less on research and development during the late 1970s, throughout the 1980s, during the Carter and Reagan defense modernization periods. Cold War ended, 1990s. The premier threat environment and the premier deterrent challenge was dissimilar, although it was still kind of there in the background, and research ramped up during that period of time. We were spending a lot more on the next generation of fighter aircraft, the next aircraft carrier program, stealth technologies, computer net-centric capabilities, et cetera. So research and development spending peaked while we were purchasing much fewer of those things. Then we get into this period right now where we have kind of a flat trend. We're spending about the same on research and development, and we're not seeing an uptick in the payoff of that research investment. So you'd expect to see, after millions and billions of dollars spent over decades on researching and developing a lot of these new technologies, that you would start to see those transition to the field. We're only now just starting to see a leveling off of that research and development curve. And we are hoping that a lot of these kind of next generation technologies are going to start to drive that curve down right now. But from what we can tell, based on what the budget says and what we can tell about the individual programs, it's kind of a gamble right now.
And Suzanne, I kind of want to turn to you here, because this is also about innovation cycles and shortening them. And you already mentioned a few of the hang-ups, integration, science is hard. It also seems, I wonder if there's also a cultural aspect to this as well, as it relates to risk and the effort to buy down risk over time. That transition point can come. So from your perspective in the building, can you speak a little bit to that?
Yeah, I mean, let's just back up half a second and forgive me if I'm explaining something that's obvious, but why do we make a distinction between RDT&E and procurement? Why is that a thing, right? It's because Congress wants a gate check, right? They want a gate check that the department has done its due diligence in the developmental phase of a thing before they start putting real money down, right? Another reason for these curves is, frankly, that developing systems is less expensive than buying them. And so you will see the curve shift in periods of fiscal contraction, which is another, I think, very salient thing that comes out of the data. But the whole reason for this distinction is to support an oversight objective, very legit. I'm not being critical. A legitimate oversight objective from the Congress. And so, as you start to kind of, unpack that, something that I've spent an enormous amount of time thinking about over the course of the past decade is, can we support that oversight role in a way that is more efficient? And there have been lots of ideas on how to do that. I've taken a swing at several of them. I came up with some of them when I worked here before. I tried a couple out while I was in the government. I definitely can't plant the mission accomplished banner in that, but it is something that's definitely worth thinking about. I mean, of course, there are ways in which we can adjust our own, and again, I mean across the executive and legislative branches, processes in order to move more efficiently, and we should keep trying, in those spaces. Although I will say very clearly and directly, that's not going to fix it, right? And I've completely lost track of the question you asked.
No, that's okay.
And I got excited about it.
I appreciate your reaction. I should have offered you first the avenue for your reactions to what Carlton said. But the next question, and I think that's also very helpful, because I think when we get to the space conversation later, that kind of innovative approach is going to be, I think, very salient. But the next question was also just, you had mentioned some of the hang-ups for innovation cycles are related to integration, the difficulty of science. And I was also wondering if you have a perspective on the idea that there's also a cultural aspect to this as well, where there's a constant effort to buy down risk, appropriately so. We want to make stuff that works. And as you said, works for the 18-year-olds in the desert or wherever they may be. But is there a place at which we can start to make trade-offs for the sake of speed or what have you? What's your thought there?
I'm not sure culture is the right word.
Sure.
I tend to think more about incentives, and the Department of Defense as an institution is a risk-averse institution, and it should be, because the mission is too critical to fail, right? So a certain amount of risk aversion is very appropriate in that context. Something that I have also thought a lot about over the course of the past decade is, when should our risk, it's dynamic depending on the type of program and the type of thing you're buying. There are instances where we should be extraordinarily risk averse. And there are other instances where we can afford to take more risk. If you're talking about a relatively low cost, attritable system, like, yeah, what's the worst that could happen, right? If you are talking about something like an F-47, we're going to be a little more risk averse, right? And so I think that there is space for, again, both the Congress and the executive branch, both, to lean harder into making more sophisticated determinations about what is the acceptable level of risk for a specific program or under a specific set of circumstances, for sure.
Great. Todd, I want to turn the question to you as well, but thinking about the innovative use of these budgeting titles. So you've done a lot of work in space policy and budget issues broadly, and we talked a little bit earlier about the way that the lines between RDT&E, procurement, and even other funding titles is getting blurred. Does that raise some concern for you in terms of muddying the swim lanes of budgeting authorities, and then also in terms of the transparency of the allocation of taxpayer dollars? Or is that something that you see as potentially conducive to accelerating these cycles and possibly opening up the doors for more responsible risk-taking too?
Yeah, I mean, I fully take Susanna's point about, there is an important role for Congress here in having insight and oversight. And I know it can be a pain in the butt for the department a lot of times, but it is a net positive in our system of government, I think. And I think public transparency also is a net positive. This is a good thing that helps us. This is an advantage we have as a nation over closed societies like China, where the government does whatever it wants and there's really no oversight, or public scrutiny. So I think we need to embrace that as an advantage, not as a weakness. I don't see the department going in that direction right now, but that is, I think, a core American value in our system that we should continue to value. When it comes to the budget system, if you will, the way the titles of the budget are broken out, I think the PPBE Commission that issued their report last year, I think they got it exactly right. That this is, the titles of the budget are laid out for an industrial era, industrial age military, right? Where you develop something and you test it and then you produce it and then you operate it, maintain it, and dispose it. That is what it was set up for. That is not how modern technology often operates. There's still some systems that are going to be like that. But the truly innovative stuff that's out there, especially things that are software heavy, software driven, what is the difference between development and operation, or maintenance of code? It's all kind of blending together. And so, I fully endorse what the commission ended up, one of their many recommendations is we need to switch the budget model entirely. And I would go all in on mission-based budgeting and still give Congress all of the insight and oversight. And, you can work that into it. It's not about, obfuscating how the money is being spent. It's about giving the right flexibility in the right places to where DOD can move money around more efficiently. And that is what I think would fundamentally help you unlock these faster innovation cycles where you can take advantage of advances in technology in areas that you may not have thought about 2 years prior in order to get it into the POM process, to get it into the budget request that then Congress acts on after a 6-month CR. That kind of cycle for getting new ideas in just doesn't work, right? And so we need more mission-based budgeting. And something I've been toying about, I haven't written anything yet, but I've been chatting about it with folks, is maybe more of this should actually be put into mandatory funding. And not mandatory as in you have to spend it, but mandatory as in it's on autopilot, right? Set it as a formula, for larger parts of the budget than already are. Maybe that is a way to get through this. And there's potentially an opportunity right now on the Hill because everyone recognizes the budget process is not working. It is not working right now, and it is not going to fix itself. So we need some major reforms. We need some big ideas, and I think a lot of these ideas are already out there.
This is very helpful, and I think changing gears a little bit in perhaps an ironic way, because I think you're right, a lot of these challenges do stem from new capabilities and a new age of what our military wants to look like. It's not, software updates were not necessarily the problem when the budget process was conceived. But there are also still traditional capabilities that remain very relevant. Munitions, artillery shells remain something that's been a constant in our military for decades, and yet we're still having trouble procuring adequately and at speed and responsively. So turning a little bit to this procurement side of the equation, and I know you've written some of this with McKinsey, and I know Our boss, Stacy, has toiled a lot on munitions procurement. What do you see as the major budgetary impediments there for something that's been a traditional staple of the budget cycle, but still we're having trouble responsively procuring?
It's predictability, stability, right? And getting a demand signal out to industry that is credible and that is accurate. And I think that's the biggest problem. And I think it's too easy. Like, we have this budget simulator, the Defense Future Simulator, that we put online. And if you go and you give yourself an artificial budget problem, right? Like, okay, you've got your baseline budget and you've now been told by whoever, OMB, cut 10 billion out of it. How do you do that with the least long-term disruption? It becomes very tempting to take a little bit out of this munitions program, a little bit out of this one, right? And you see that happen time after time. Congress does it, DOD does it, right? The services themselves will do it. They need to find a little more money. These things you can just, fluctuate from year to year, how many you're buying. And if you're always taking from it, to fix some near-term problem,
next thing you know.
Yeah. And next thing you know that, you're going to fire, a quarter of all the THAAD interceptors you've ever built in like a 12-day period, like that's the kind of problem we run into. So, again, I know this is a preformed idea here I'm throwing out, but are there ways we could put these programs where they are more locked in on a buying schedule where Congress can still come back and change it every year if they want to, but by default, they can continue on some program path.
We did give that a shot, Todd, if you'll recall.
Yeah, well, but it needs to be on the Hill.
I'm talking specifically of the multi-year procurements, which
Yeah.
Congress did approve some of them, again, for the specific reason to provide industry with a more consistent, credible demand signal.
But it's not enough. You need Congress to lock themselves in, and a multi-year procurement is not enough. They can revise it, right? And it was only for some programs. So I think we've got to do more, and we got to get serious about building these things at scale, like real scale. Like war. Like, could we actually fight a war with this capability? And we're not at that yet. And many of these munitions and missile interceptors and things.
I'm Susanna, very much appreciating the interjections and the gut checks to make sure that we're keeping on track.
I think that means he's not
Live fact check.
appreciating.
No, it is appreciated. It is appreciated. So I do want to turn to you as well, Carlton. So in the report, we talk about a lot of the low-hanging fruit opportunities that we see in different capability areas. We talk a lot about combat aircraft. We talk a lot about long-range fires. We have some creative ideas for shipbuilding. Can you tell us a little bit about what your recommendations would be for tackling some of these procurement problems?
I guess this is the sky is not falling portion of today's event. So we have been talking, obviously, there are shortfalls in future modernization and long-term modernization, and these are all obviously modernization bets. But what we found by going through kind of piece by piece on the budget and looking at some of these particular game-changing systems that can contribute now, whether that's longer range ground fires, whether that's extended range or survivable aircraft, there are opportunities there for systems that are either, they're being purchased, but they're being purchased in lower numbers. They're in kind of the research and development phase still, but they're towards the end of that process, and they're really just awaiting the green light to transition into production and fielding. These are the systems, right, that can close that gap now. They're not going to be the systems that are going to win wars in 15, 20, 30 years. Those are still on the horizon. But they are the systems that can contribute to changing the deterrence calculus right now in the Indo-Pacific in particular. Long-range fires is a great example. There's a lot of newer systems that are coming online, particularly since INF lapsed, that really close the range gap in a theater where range is one of the most important factors of concept planning and mission planning and operations. These systems, they use existing munitions for the most part. A lot of the innovation with a lot of these longer range ground-based fires are that they're using new launching platforms, or they're adapting existing launching platforms, say from a naval variant to a ground-based variant. But they're using munitions that are in a pipeline, though as Todd noted, the pipeline right now is maybe not perhaps producing war-winning quantities of those munitions, but it's there. Similarly with strike aircraft, we found that while there are some hiccups right now with the F-35's modernization program, it's still on track to be a fully modernized program with aircraft that can really contribute game-changing capabilities in the theater. F-15EX is another one. B-21, though it's a next generation technology, is certainly an opportunity there, particularly if it's scaled into greater numbers to really contribute some more of that long-range penetrating strike capability. So there are immediate wins that can be had, and that's not even getting into a lot of these lower-cost, high-density attritable systems, which are obviously an option for certain scenarios. There are wins that can be had right now. We just need to start ramping that up. And one thing that I'll just say on that note is, throughout the report and throughout the discussion, we're not saying abandon this long-term modernization spending. It's not a question of we need to take money from the long-term bets and put those into near-term opportunities. It's really taking a balanced approach that says we have gaps that are, they exist right now. Those gaps are eroding at our ability to deter and possibly fight a war in the Indo-Pacific. Let's do what we can to ramp those up where possible, but let's not completely abandon. Let's just rebalance and optimize our future plans.
So to take a step further on a specific example, I know a lot of folks are interested right now in Golden Dome and F-47. Let's start with F-47 as an example. It occurs to me that this program, this initiative, is coming at a really interesting time for combat aircraft. There has been a lot of discussion about the prospective opportunities that are coming with B-21, that it's moving on time, and that potentially is going to have a procurement size that is exceeding initial expectations. On the other hand, there continue to be difficulties with F-35 modernization that you mentioned. What are the lessons that F-47 planners and budgeteers can be taking from each of those stories to go forward and hopefully make F-47 the success that we all want it to be? And Carlton, that's to you first.
Sure. So F-35 is a huge program, right? It's been a program of record now for decades. There have been stumbling blocks. There have been significant successes too. Eventually it will be one of the most high-density platforms in use across Western militaries. So it's not to say that there are not lessons to be learned there. I think part of the issue is that integration, as Todd was saying earlier, has to be something that's considered from the start. I know that they're incorporating that into the F-47, right? Because the F-47 is going to be an even higher technology aircraft. It's going to have modular mission systems. It's going to need to develop over time. F-35 has been doing that as well, although we've seen some hiccups, right, with getting that across the finish line each iteration, but that's completely to be expected. So what can be done now, whether that's on the software side, whether it's on the hardware side, in terms of designing that aircraft and designing that program to make it so that it's modular, it's designed with an eye towards upgradability, and it's designed with a system that can evolve over time. And then on the program management side, right, I mean, it's the boilerplate stuff of oversight into the program's timeline, oversight into the program's spending. These are the type of things that we say need to be done with every program, but it's important to just foot stomp them.
Suzanne, I know you've had a close-up look at both of those from your seat. What do you think the lessons to be learned are going forward for F-47?
I'm going to go rogue again and answer a slightly different question than the one you asked.
Go for it.
Because, F-47, in a lot of ways, as Todd and I have already back and forth about a little bit, is like a very traditional procurement exercise, right? I think, seconding everything Carlton just said about, will the promises of these, modular open system architectures deliver? I mean, that's all extremely critical and important progress that we ought to be looking at. But just to say something different than what Carlton said, I think the real learning, again, is going to occur, I think, when you compare something like F-47 to CCA, right? Like, they're different. We should treat them differently from a programmatic perspective, from a program management perspective, from an oversight perspective, right? That to me is kind of like that's the question, right?
Well, it's interesting, too, that they're concurrent programs, too, right? So CCA and the Next Generation Air Dominance Fighter F-47, they're developing on a similar timeline to fit a similar air concept, right, the future of air warfare. But how differently are we treating them? And I don't necessarily know if they're separated both in the public's mind, but also within the building as two distinct programs that should have two distinct development and procurement theories of victory behind them, right? NGAD F-47 is a large traditional combat aircraft program that's going to develop over decades. We don't know how many or what the final cost of that program is going to be, but it's certainly not going to be in the density that the CCA is being envisioned as, which is supposed to be much lower cost. It's supposed to be, producing multiple iterations very quickly over time to contribute this capability that might be effective for 5 years, and then we go to the next one. then we got a 5-year, and then we go to the next one, whereas F-47 is supposed to be something that's going to get us going for decades.
Yeah.
Well, if you remember Will Roper, when he was the acquisition chief in the Air Force, he talked about this idea of a Century Series aircraft where it was, like, we'll buy this for 5 years, we maybe only keep it for 10 or 15 years and then retire it, and we'll just keep moving on to the next generation. I mean, first of all, is Congress going to let you retire it if you spent, $30 million a platform, buying it? Are you really going to retire it if it's got life left in it? Probably not. And so then are you really going to be able to keep buying different versions of it every 5 years? And then if you do that, you end up with a whole bunch of small fleets of aircraft that are hard to support, right? Each one has to have a different training pipeline, different maintenance pipeline, training for the maintainers, right? You end up with a whole mess, and that is a recipe for an Air Force that gets smaller and smaller over time. I think that Century Series approach would work in space much better for satellites in LEO, where they're only going to hang up there for 5 years anyway. That works well. Congress can't extend the life of something that's deorbiting because of atmospheric drag. And it doesn't sit in anyone's
They might
state
try.
anyway, as long as we don't create a Space National Guard, But no, but I mean, like, I think that model, like, I don't see how it's going to work out for the Air Force other than the Air Force just continuing to get smaller over time.
Yeah. Let's use this. Susanna, do you want to add?
No, good. I wasn't going to disagree. I was going to yes, Todd.
Okay.
I think it'll be really interesting also to see how Congress thinks about or treats the difference between crewed and uncrewed platforms, right? So we've already seen them draw a line that uncrewed ships don't count as capital ships,
Yeah.
which is interesting, right? And they haven't quite weighed in the same way when it comes to aircraft. So I don't know, watch this space. I think it's interesting.
Yeah.
I do want to use this as a segue, since you mentioned space, to go to everyone's new favorite topic, Golden Dome. But before we do that, I do want to remind everybody to drop your questions online into the chat box. We are going to come to you guys momentarily, and the in-person audience too. So if you have questions formulating, we will get there shortly. So Golden Dome brings, I think, a lot of this to the fore. It's a priority new program. There's a lot of discussion about taking a lot of these innovative approaches to the field on it. We looked at it a little bit in the report, and one of the things that jumps out immediately is just the scale of the potential end result, and especially considering the amount of infrastructure investment that's required, the amount of technology development that could be required. We are skeptical, I'll say, that in the near term we'll see immediate dividends in the program. I'm curious to know what your thoughts are, and particularly if you could take us on the resourcing side of it too. Do you think that the way the funding model is currently set up, where it relies so much on reconciliation, is going to be conducive to it meeting its goals?
I mean, one thing to keep in mind is, we all focus a lot on the space side of Golden Dome. Golden Dome is a lot of things other than space as well, right? It could include lots of ground-based interceptors, ground-based radars, ship-based radars, It could include a lot of different things depending on what they ultimately want the architecture to be capable of doing, which they have not publicly defined that, right? Is it supposed to, intercept, swarms of small drones that are operating near, military bases in the U.S.? Is it supposed to protect critical infrastructure in the U.S.? Or is it only going to be focused on like a strategic nuclear strike from Russia or China, or both of them simultaneously, or a rogue missile from North Korea, right? Like, there are a lot of different ways you could go with this. They have not really defined out what it is they're trying to do with the system. But, with that said, like, there's a lot of money going into it already. We ought to just step back and appreciate they announced the idea of a program. They stood up a new program office at a, much higher level than usual. And Congress pre-appropriated $24.5 billion without a program plan, schedule, requirements, nothing, right? That is unprecedented, right? Never have we seen that much money appropriated in advance of a program actually starting. So there is all this reconciliation money already sitting there, and it's good for 5 years, or more like 4 now. But so it's sitting there. It will be spent. There's a lot of flexibility in that money and how they spend it. It is not a sustainable funding model, though. I wrote a commentary a few months ago, asking the question, is reconciliation the new OCO? I later realized that when I asked the question, a lot of people didn't read the article and they just assumed I thought it was. But the whole point of the article was, no, it's not. There, overseas contingency operations funding, that was tied to ongoing operations. And yes, you could stick non-war related stuff in there year after year, and you could feel pretty sure it would get through Congress, because who's going to cut funding for operations of troops that are out, risking their lives overseas, right? That vehicle is going to go through every year. You're going to get the OCO funding. That is not true with reconciliation. Defense was just like, a lucky rider on the side of this reconciliation bill. It was a confluence of, Republicans having control of, House, the Senate, and the White House, and having a unifying reason to push through this bill, which was tax cuts, which now has been taken care of. I don't know what that unifying, purpose for a reconciliation next year would be, and if defense could even ride on that again. And then after the midterm elections, all bets are off if one party, changes control in one chamber of Congress. So this is not a sustainable way to fund it. If they want to actually keep advancing these, all of the different systems and programs within Golden Dome, it's got to be in the base budget. And if they're trying to keep the base budget flat at current levels, like including that Golden Dome funding would require really catastrophic, cuts in the other parts of the military.
Or very politically challenging top line increases.
Yeah, which it looks like
very,
OMB is not on board with.
Yeah.
So we'll have to see. But the FY27 request is going to be telling. Do they put this in the base budget, or do they continue to try to rely on reconciliation?
Right.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Carlton.
We talk about that a little bit in our look at reconciliation within the report, where we say, look, it's hard to say that $150 billion of investment in defense expansion and modernization is a bad thing, right? There's a lot of good stuff in there, particularly on the munitions side, that's going to make a difference relatively quickly. Our concern was on the modernization side, particularly with things like Golden Dome and the associated program of programs that is Golden Dome, but also some of the longer range strike aircraft type stuff that's coming through F-47 and whatnot. It's a down payment, right? And it relies on continued sustained funding, whether or not that's through the 4-year availability now of the reconciliation funding, or it's through consistent increases, reinjection first of that money back into the base budget, right, up from the current FY26, incorporating the reconciliation into the FY27. But that relies on a lot of sustained goodwill and hope that that money is going to be continually put back into the base budget going forward. Otherwise, a lot of these programs, specifically like Golden Dome, that are generational, decade-plus investments in putting these systems online, they could flounder, right? They could lose steam because of political decisions, because of a lack of defense being able to ride onto those fiscal headwinds. So we see the point that reconciliation was a quite magnificent investment in defense. However, we do have questions going forward about whether or not that's a sustainable model.
Sure. All right, at this time, let's turn to some audience questions. Is there anybody in the audience that would like to ask? I saw the hand up here in the front first. Kalina is going to jump over to you in 1 second. And sir, if you could just please identify yourself and then go ahead.
Michael Gordon, Wall Street Journal. The CIA has famously said that 2027 is a date by which the Chinese leadership wants its military to be prepared for Taiwan contingency, not necessarily to undertake it, but to be ready to do it. My question is, in your assessment, will the U.S. have the right near-term capability, and what capability will it have in place to deter such Chinese actions by 2027? Is the Pentagon marching toward this goal and giving it sufficient weight? Lastly, the operations that the administration has undertaken so far with the campaign against the Houthis, which required expenditure of a lot of munitions, now hemispheric operations, those don't eat into R&D, presumably, but they certainly eat up a lot of O&M and munitions. What is the effect of that on fielding this kind of near-term capability?
Any volunteers to go first?
I think it's really important to remember that China the PRC is not a 2027 problem. It is a today, tomorrow, next year, right? And so, when I have thought about the competitive challenge that the PRC presents, I always think about it in that way, right? In that, we need to be ready now, we need to be ready in 2 years' time, we need to be ready 5 years after that. And all of that requires investment now and later. Listen, I'm like very bullish on the United States military. It's the finest fighting force in the world. And so, I've got confidence in our, first of all, our ability to deter. And beyond that, prevail if necessary against any adversary, but it's going to continue to take hard government work, always, every single cycle, in order to keep and extend pace vis-a-vis that challenge, particularly.
I think the 2027 date it's gotten a lot of air in the discussion, certainly. As mentioned, though, deterrence is a problem for today and tomorrow. And I've heard talk of not looking at 2027 as a hard deadline, but 2027 is the current goalpost. And how can we continue to enhance what I would agree is the finest force in the world so that 2027 date becomes 2028, 2029, 2030. You're moving that goalpost away where China's calculus is that there is no benefit in challenging deterrence right now, as there has not been to date, right? China has not challenged that deterrent capability so far. So how can we continue to push through force modernization today, tomorrow, and well into the future so that that goalpost keeps moving and that there is no reason for them to challenge deterrence?
Yeah, I mean, I would just say, I think 2027 is a good pacing point, right? Because that's when the adversaries explicitly told themselves they want to be able to catch up with you by then and accomplish this mission that we want to deter them from being able to do. So it's a good kind of intellectual exercise to have that pacing point out there. I am as much concerned about our will to deter or defeat an invasion of Taiwan in 2027 as I am about our capability. What we're seeing and hearing in this administration and the shift in strategy they're talking about is looking like many more of our forces are not going to be in the Pacific. They're going to be back here in the Western Hemisphere, and we're going to be focused much more on drug cartels than we are on the PRC. And that makes me worry that, if we're not prepared strategically, if we don't show that we have the political will, that almost invites aggression by China. And so I am concerned at what's going to come out with this new national defense strategy and national security strategy, and does that basically give China a green light?
I think the last part that kind of went unanswered a little bit was whether or not some of these other operations are putting a dent in our capability. We've all seen the reports of the number of defensive interceptors, offensive munitions that were utilized, whether it's in the Red Sea, whether that was in defense of Israel, or now some of these more emergent situations in the Western Hemisphere. That's like the obvious part. The other part that kind of goes unsaid is the stress that that's putting on the readiness of the force, right? F-18s falling off aircraft carriers is not a good thing for air capabilities going forward. And we say in the report that an aging force is a more expensive force. It's more costly to maintain. It's more costly to operate. So there's also that incentive to try and modernize the force going forward, is reducing some of those costs.
Can I just add one thing,
Sure.
too? That you're exactly right in the report. The older your equipment gets, really regardless of domain, the more expensive it is to operate and maintain. What's also true is a next generation force is even more expensive to operate and maintain. And we see that throughout generations of weapon systems, that in their early years, they're way more expensive. But even once they settle in, and become more stable, they're still more expensive to operate and maintain on a per platform, per unit basis than prior generations in most cases. And so that is a perpetual problem. And what it means is that your O&M and your personnel budget and everything, that's got to grow faster than inflation just to keep pace with the size force you have today.
There's a whole maintainability conversation here that I would love to get into, but we only have 10 minutes left, and we do have one question from the online audience that I want to bring in. It is a very topical question. How is the shutdown affecting modernization efforts? And then the second part of this that I want to pose to you is, what can the department and Congress do to improve their relationship with each other? And Go ahead, Todd.
I'll take this. I mean, it's hard to know the shutdown effects just yet. I know we're like 3 weeks into it, but a lot of acquisition programs, right? They've got money that's still available from prior years. They can kind of keep things moving. I think probably a bigger disruption that we're seeing in the short term for acquisition programs is the deferred resignation program. And the exodus of really trained acquisition professionals and contracting folks within the civilian workforce that are leaving in droves. I think the number I've seen is about 14% of the Space Force's civilian workforce took DRP. That is not something we're going to be able to recover from. And if you want to go fast on Golden Dome type capabilities that involve space, like you just undercut yourself by letting these people leave. And when, deferred resignation program, that was people got to choose for themselves, right? That's not merit-based, that's self-selection. Who's going to self-select out? People who have the best opportunities to get another job, right? That's who you're going to tend to lose. So I think we've really undercut our workforce, and that is going to have very long-term effects beyond this shutdown.
Suzanne, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I think Todd's right in terms of it's hard to know exactly the specific effects of this particular shutdown. But what I can say is that this shutdown is part of a much broader story around continuing resolutions, last minute, budget processes that inject an enormous amount of instability into the system and make it much, much harder to move, right? I mean, if you are essentially stuck in a department that at this stage does not plan to conduct any new starts for like the first 6 months of the year because they're expecting to be under a CR, that's not good, right? And so, whether or not this specific shutdown is causing a crisis in any specific program, and I'm sure we could find one where it's been a real problem. It is part and parcel of this much broader trend that has been going on for decades that makes it that much harder, right? I mean, you talk about process fixes and flexibility, like start here, right? Like, how about you just make the process that we have actually work like it's supposed to, and that would be a great jumping off point for further reform.
It's a fundamental big issue. We do have a little bit more time for one more audience question. I'm going to go to the lady here in the purple. And again, ma'am, if you would please just introduce yourself.
Hi, Alyssa Miller, Beacon Global Strategies. I have one good question for Todd and then a broader question. Todd, you talked a little bit about mission-based budgeting. So the Army in their FY26 budget request had flexible PE lines for EW, counter UAS, and UAS. So just curious if you think that will enable them to make trades across portfolios. And then for the broader group, on the RDT&E point, but a little bit separate from the discussion on exquisite platforms that was in the report, there's been a proliferation in recent years of these rapid experimentation initiatives. And I'm curious, we haven't necessarily seen the same level of proliferation of the transition of that technology. And some of that is by design. You want some of that to, fail and do that rapid experimentation again and again. But is there a better way to structure some of those programs or initiatives so that you do see more outcomes that are informing procurement down the line?
Yeah, so I think that we see, good baby steps in the right direction, like, what you cited with the Army doing. I mean, we saw it, years earlier with the Budget Activity 8 within RDT&E, where, it was basically software pilot programs, but it could do, maintenance, it could do development, whatever, all in there together. I think those baby steps realistically are necessary. You've got to get Congress and you've got to get OMB and you've got to get folks within the Pentagon bureaucracy comfortable with a different way of doing business. But at some point, we've got to break down these artificial barriers in the budget in the way that we're allocating money and allocate it in a different way. And so at some point, we've actually got to break that and try something different. It's going to be scary. But, if Congress is, considering like a 1.5 year long CR, maybe now's the time. If they're already ceding that much control anyway, And they're basically admitting that the whole appropriations process is broken and they cannot fix it like within an entire session of Congress, then yeah, why not try something different now?
We had a broader discussion about some of this kind of blurred lines between RDT&E and procurement, particularly on the software side, but also even some on these fail-fast type hardware approaches, where in color of money terms, how do you determine in an iterative software evolution cycle where that line is between this is a development product, now this is a production product, because both are being used, right, in operational circumstances. SDA is a great example of most of that money, except for launch, is going through RDT&E, and they are putting up proliferated constellations of satellites at scale, right? But that's something that's defined by color of money terms as RDT&E. So I would agree with Todd's point. I don't think in the current system of budgeting and titling, there's a way to really necessarily fix that. I think by questioning the value of the current system, we can start to drive the conversation in a direction. I don't know if it's mission-based, I don't know if it's portfolio-based or what have you, but where you have a more flexible system that's able to account for the fact that outside of these exquisite technologies that are more traditional acquisition programs, we need to change how we think about development, iteration, and deployment.
We only have 4 minutes left, so I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative and ask the last question. We are all anticipating a potential change in the forthcoming national defense strategy. There's been a lot of reporting about the potential to elevate the homeland. It's not necessarily a foregone conclusion at all that China cedes priority in that formulation, but there's rumbling that there will be a different formulation altogether of the strategic priorities of the department in the next strategy. How do you anticipate potential changes to the strategy impacting the FY27 budget? And if you could pick one thing that you would hope either retains its position or an approach that you would like to see change in the FY27 budget, what would that be? And Carlton, sorry, doing a bad job pointing to the next answer. Go ahead, Carlton.
Sure, no, it's perfectly fine. So as a former and now recovering academic, I've had the pleasure of looking very deeply at a lot of these previous national defense strategy shakeups. Homeland defense has always been the #1 national security priority for the Pentagon and for the White House. That has not changed since 1947 when the department was established. There's been various ways of how Homeland Defense was guaranteed. Throughout the Cold War, it was Homeland Defense through forward defense. Now things are changing slightly. So I do think that if there is, there's a rumored change in the national defense strategy's prioritization, or relative prioritization, I should say, that's going to elevate whether it's going to be hemispheric defense or homeland defense. I think part of that's warranted, right? We've seen the threat to the homeland change significantly. It's no longer a question of, relying on water to protect invading armies and relying on early warning and deterrence to avoid long-range missile strikes. There are new threat vectors, whether that's the proliferation of drones, cheaper cruise missile technologies, or what have you, cyber, all of that. Maybe there should be a conversation about how we reprioritize those types of things. I would hope, and my big ask for the strategy and for the budget going forward is that the big warfighting concerns, the big military deterrence concerns about forward defense remain intact. I do not suspect that there's going to be this huge reprioritization of spending, whether that's away from the Indo-Pacific or what have you, and pumping it into hemispheric defense, because they're different mission sets, they're different spending sets, very different things go into defending the homeland than projecting power in the Indo-Pacific or in the Eurasian landmass. So I am optimistic. I'm certainly not pessimistic about the forthcoming national defense strategy. And in terms of the FY27 budget, it would be really fantastic if we could have it come on time, if we could have advice and consent between the branches of government on that, if we could have the type of oversight, transparency that we've been talking about this entire time. That would be my big ask in terms of budget.
Thanks. Susanna, what do you see as the implications and what's your big ask?
Yeah, I mean, as Carlton correctly points out, you're going to be hard pressed to find a president anywhere ever who's going to say that Homeland Defense is not important. And in fact, it is an implied mission in any other threat set one might consider, right? But as with anything, the devil's in the details, right? And so you got to look kind of underneath that next layer to, what would a potential shift in priorities at that level, if you could even categorize it as a shift, which is a question. What does that mean for force planning, sizing, and shaping? And those are, that's the question, and I don't know the answer yet.
Yeah, the thing I'm watching is, of course, Homeland Defense will be number one. It's always number one, right? Either explicitly or implicitly. I think what'll be different is how they redefine what Homeland Defense includes for the military missions that involves. We're already seeing that they view Homeland Defense in this administration as including border security, counter-drug operations, even domestic law enforcement, right? And so if they are changing the definition of what is included in Homeland Defense, then yeah, I think those are very different capability sets, things that the military is not used to doing, and is not necessarily that good at doing, or appropriate or legal to do in some cases. Then I think that could change a lot of things. But at the end of the day, the National Defense Strategy is a piece of paper, and it's not worth anything unless, like, the administration actually intends to follow it, to use it as a guiding framework. I'm not sure that there is any strategy document that will actually, frame or constrain or guide what the president chooses to do on a day-to-day basis. So I don't know that it'll end up being that important. And then, the other side of strategy is, not only do they stick to it, but do they fund it in the budget? And again, I think this budget is being driven more out of OMB than DOD. And I don't think OMB is going to feel constrained at all or guided at all by this piece of paper that Bridge Colby is going to produce. So yeah, I think it may be shocking. It may redefine a lot of terms in the way we know them, but ultimately it may not be that consequential.
Yeah, and then it goes back also to Susanna's point about execution. Whatever the strategy is at one point is only as important as the execution down the line. I want to really thank our panelists for all their time today and all their thoughtful answers, and thank you to everybody who joined us in person and online. That is all the time that we have, but we welcome you to stay behind for a little bit and enjoy some coffee and refreshments on your way out.